Hey, hey, hey! My name's Helianthus Cryptid, or Nephilim if you'd prefer. Welcome to my cozy corner of the internet. I am here! With the 4th chapter of Sitting in a Tin Can, written by Aurorian on AO3. Wait, that's the wrong anime. Whoops! My voice might sound a little different because I've had my braces removed, but it doesn't really matter that much. I shall bestow upon you the trigger warnings, and then we can get straight into the chapter. This fanfiction includes topics that may be triggering to some viewers if you are likely to be affected by any of the following: implied homophobia, implied prostitution, and implied drug dealing, then please consider listening to one of my other videos, such as the Adro series, which is written by XX Cypress Minerva XX. Now I implore you to sit back and relax whilst I read to you. Chapter 4. Feeling very still. Oikawa was silent on the way home from the Karasuno vs Shiro Torizawa match. "I thought you'd be happy that Uchijima had been beaten," Iwaizumi said after 15 minutes of nothing but the sounds of their feet hitting the concrete sidewalk. Oikawa sighed and looked up at the sky. "Not when it was Tobio-chan who beat him." He kicked a tiny pebble, and they watched it bounce along the sidewalk. "He always has to ruin everything." Iwaizumi raised his hand in the air and smacked between Oikawa's shoulder blades. Oikawa frowned and pulled his navy jacket tighter around him, and crossed his arms over his chest. "He's just a kid, Crappy-kawa," he muttered, even though Iwaizumi had cried yesterday when they lost to him. He'd cried, and so did the rest of the team. But Kageyama was still just a kid, a tiny first-year boy, who was only 15 years old. Oikawa scoffed. "That was our last chance to beat Ushiwaka." Iwaizumi looked at his friend when his voice cracked dangerously. He had to watch Oikawa cry yesterday, and he wasn't sure he wanted to see it again. "We should go hang out at your house, see if Doctor Who is on or something." Oikawa sniffled into his sleeve. "It's not," he said, "but come over anyway." Iwaizumi nodded. "Course I'm coming over." He watched Oikawa kick the pebble again, and it bounced even further. Oikawa nodded, and Iwaizumi ignored his tears, because he knew if he pointed them out, Oikawa would explode. His pride wouldn't be able to handle it. Iwaizumi watched Oikawa's face get more and more red as they got closer to his house. The sight made his own chest tighten up, but he tried to keep a straight face, at least until they got into Oikawa's room. As soon as they were over the threshold, Iwaizumi was pulling off his jacket and his grey hoodie, and collapsing onto Oikawa's bed. He looked up at the stickers where glow-in-the-dark stars had been stuck years ago, and waited for Oikawa to join him. The shuffling on the other side of the room, Oikawa changing out of his dumb disguise and into a worn-out t-shirt and soft plaid pajama bottoms, eventually stopped, and Iwaizumi felt the mattress dip. Oikawa crawled over to Iwaizumi, and face planted into his pillow with a groan and a long sniffle. "You okay?" Iwaizumi whispered. Oikawa lifted his face to glare at Iwaizumi, but the effect was ruined because his brown eyes were puffy and red from crying. So he just shook his head, wrapped an arm around Iwaizumi's waist, and curled up into his side, with his face pressed against Iwaizumi's jaw. Iwaizumi sighed. Cuddling wasn't new. Oikawa had always been overdramatic, and the smallest bruise could apparently only be remedied by a long, drawn-out hug, and in some instances, a kiss. But this wasn't a small bruise or a scrape or anything a hug could cure. This was Oikawa's entire high school career down the drain. So Iwaizumi pulled Oikawa closer, slipping a hand under his blue t-shirt, and lightly scratched his back, the way he sometimes asked Iwaizumi to do. And they were silent, and Iwaizumi stared up at the stickers on the ceiling. Iwa-chan, Oikawa said softly after a while, and Awizumi felt himself twitch a little because he had been so sure that Oikawa was asleep. Yeah, he whispered back. He wasn't sure why he was whispering, because nobody was home, but interrupting the long-standing silence in Oikawa's room felt like it was against unknown rules. Awizumi felt Oikawa push his face harder into his neck, and his breath fanned across the tan skin. Can we go for a walk? Oikawa's quiet voice was muffled, but Awizumi still heard the vulnerability in it, something that wasn't really common for Oikawa. Despite knowing that Awizumi could see straight through his bullshit, he had the habit of lying and pretending around him. It was refreshing to hear some honesty for once. Refreshing, but also very unsettling. Yeah, he replied and removed his hands from under Oikawa's shirt. Of course. Oikawa pushed himself so he was sitting up on his bed, with his long legs loosely entwined with Awizumi's. His hair was all tangled at the front from where he had been lying down, and Awizumi fought a smile. Letting Oikawa know that his hair was anything but perfect would set off the whining, although Awizumi had a feeling that messy hair wasn't on Oikawa's list of things to care about at that moment. Awizumi sat up next, and picked his hoodie up off the floor. He watched Oikawa walk over to his wardrobe, and take his Alba Josei jacket from the hanger. They walked outside in silence. Nighttime air always felt better to Awizumi. When he was a kid, it felt like laughter, and making fun of Oikawa for the one time he'd dressed up in his mum's fur coat and giant sunglasses. He had dragged Awizumi down the street with no fear of traffic because it was 11 at night. Way past bedtime! How cool, Iwa-chan! And the sounds of Oikawa's oversized heel clicking against the tarmac was the most hilarious thing Awizumi had ever heard. When he was a little older, it felt like freedom, and the very specific adrenaline rush he got from almost being caught sneaking out his bedroom window when he thought his parents were asleep. He'd slipped on the gutter because the movies made it look so easy. How was he supposed to know that the plastic wouldn't hold the weight of a 12-year-old? It had been okay though, because Awizumi had been at the bottom, filming everything on his sister's camera, and ducking into the bush when he saw the kitchen light flicker on. They hid until Awizumi's mom had gotten her glass of water and Oikawa had spat on Awizumi's scraped knees because, "This gets rid of cuts, see?" Even though all it did was wash away the dead skin around the cut. But now it just felt like a standstill. Time didn't exist when it was nighttime and you were just walking. And that's what they did. They walked for God knows how long in silence, just enjoying the company of one another, and the way their arms were pressed together tightly. They walked until Oikawa's house disappeared and gardens and fences and front doors grew fewer and far between. Their street tapered off into a smaller road lined by hedges and trees instead of houses and street lamps. Time slowed even further. Oikawa hunched his shoulders because without the artificial lights it felt suddenly colder, and he slipped his arm through Awizumi's and clutched his bicep tightly with a shiver. "I like it out here, Iwa-chan." Oikawa was still whispering, even though there were even less people out here by the construction sites. The half-built buildings were barely visible, but the stars were shining a lot brighter. "Me too." Awizumi shuffled closer to Oikawa and pressed their bodies together when he felt him shiver. "It's quiet. Peaceful." "Mm-hmm." Oikawa nodded and knocked his head gently into Awizumi's. "We should come here more often. The stars look nice." Awizumi looked up and watched the stars for a little bit. It was a clear night for October, chilly and cloudless, and he couldn't help but stare in awe at how pretty it made the stars look. He wasn't as interested in all of that space stuff as Oikawa was, but he knew when to appreciate a nice sky. "We'll do that then," he replied with a small smile. He leaned in close and pressed a soft kiss to the corner of Oikawa's mouth before pulling away. Oikawa shifted his gaze from the sky to Iwaizumi. "Iwa-chan is always so complicated. First you try and hit me, and now you kiss me? Talk about mixed signals." Iwaizumi swallowed his guilt, because that was Oikawa's teasing voice, but he had spoken so softly that it made him feel bad. "I've kissed you before, Shirikawa." Oikawa let out a tittery little laugh. "I was just pointing out how brutish Iwa-chan is. It seems like the only time you turn off your dumb caveman brain is on the court." Iwaizumi bumped their hips together only slightly harder than necessary. "Keep up talking about dumb caveman brains and I won't be kissing you again anytime soon." The moonlight illuminated Oikawa's pale skin, and Iwaizumi watched his bottom lip stick out in an exaggerated pout. "Mean," he said, but the flush on his cheeks reminded Iwaizumi that he at least felt a little better than he was earlier. "You always talk about how I'm so mean," Iwaizumi said, and pressed his lips against Oikawa's again. He kissed them softly until the pout slowly turned into a smile. "And yet you always smile when I kiss you." "That's because you're so cute, Iwa-chan." Oikawa held Iwaizumi's face in his free hand, closed his eyes and kissed him back. When they pulled apart, they looked at each other the way they always had. They were friends, they always were and they always would be, but they were also a little more than that. They were more when they stood together beneath the stars, when it was night time, and everything else stood still. "Oh, Iwaizumi!" Daichi stumbled a little as soon as he noticed the bartender. Iwaizumi looked him up and down, and Daichi unconsciously ran a hand down the creases in his plain cream shirt before a flash of recognition crossed his face. "Captain of Karasuno?" he asked, and set the bottle of vodka he was holding down on the shelf behind him. Daichi nodded and held out his hand. "Samura Daichi," he said, and Iwaizumi reached across the bar and shook his hand. "What can I get you to drink?" Iwaizumi asked after a beat of awkward silence. Daichi cleared his throat. No, actually," he said. "I'm actually here for police business." Iwaizumi Hajime had been the ace and the vice-captain of the Albujosai team, so he definitely knew who Oikawa was, and for a brief moment, Daichi remembered Kageyama Tobio telling their team that Iwaizumi and Oikawa had grown up together, and that's why they played so well as a duo. "Police?" Iwaizumi asked with raised eyebrows. "Do I need to get my boss?" Daichi shook his head, and took a step closer to the bar. "You can if you want, but I'm not here because you did anything wrong." Iwaizumi nodded like he was waiting for Daichi to continue, and Daichi finally noticed how exhausted he looked. His eyes had sunken in, with purple bags hanging below them, and his skin was a bit paler than Daichi remembered. "I'm opening a case that closed a few years ago," Daichi said and tried not to avert his eyes. "Oikawa's." Iwaizumi's hand froze over an empty glass on the bar that he was about to pick up, and his eyes narrowed. "Did they find some new evidence?" he asked. Daichi watched his hand hover over the glass and then look back up into his dull green eyes. "No," he said, "but I think I might have found something, so I'm following up on it." "And that has something to do with me?" Iwaizumi finally picked up the glass, and Daichi assumed he put it in the sink behind the bar. "Not necessarily," Daichi replied, and took out his phone. He opened it up on the picture he had taken of the woman, and the blue stamp on her hand. This woman got off the same plane as Oikawa, but she was never seen actually getting on. She turned up mid-flight. He zoomed into her hand, and tilted his phone so Iwaizumi could see. That's the stamp we use on the weekends, so people who leave during the night don't have to pay again to get back in, Iwaizumi explained, and his eyebrows furrowed as he leaned closer to the phone. It's a little faded, but it's definitely ours. Daichi nodded. Yeah, I thought so, he said, and then took back his phone. I came in to ask for the security footage from the days before Oikawa's disappearance. Daichi pulled out a small notebook and flicked through the pages. So, anything before March 31st, 2013. Iwaizumi drummed his fingers against the bar with a nod. Unless she didn't wash her hands for a week, she came in the day before. We only used those stamps on the weekend, and Oikawa went missing on a Saturday, so she probably came in on the Friday. Daichi swallowed thickly because Iwaizumi looked like he was in pain. He was trying to lean against the bar casually, but his whole body was stiff and his jaw was clenched, and Daichi couldn't imagine what it felt like to go through what he had. Not talking to Suga for a year had been hard, but he had seen him around a few times, and he had known that Suga was safe. Iwaizumi didn't have that privilege. Thank you, he said. That narrows it down quite a bit. They were silent. The only sounds in the club were the soft beating of music coming from the speakers, and the light chatter of the odd patron. Can I help? Iwaizumi asked after a second. Can I help look for Oikawa? I'm not a detective or anything, but I can help look at the cameras. I'm not a detective either, Daichi said quietly. So, yeah, if you want to spend hours watching drunk people have fun with no audio, then sure. Iwaizumi pushed himself off the counter and tried to smile. It was tense and very unnatural, but it was a smile. I'll go ask my boss for the footage, and we can leave when my shift ends in... Iwaizumi raised his arm up and looked at his watch. Half an hour? Sounds good, Daichi replied and watched Iwaizumi disappear through a back door. Daichi drove them back to his house after Iwaizumi's shift, in probably the most awkward silence he'd ever had the misfortune of being a part of. They tried small talk. Iwaizumi asked him how his job was, but all he did was give people parking tickets and check out noise complaints. Daichi tried to ask him about volleyball because that was something that he knew they both had in common. Iwaizumi apparently didn't play anymore. So they gave up, and for once, Daichi was glad he had chosen to not take the long way. Daichi didn't think it could, but it got a little bit more awkward when they pulled into his driveway and Suga was sitting on his doorstep. Daichi hadn't expected to speak to Suga again until he found Oikawa, but there he was, sitting against Daichi's door, sitting crisscross applesauce, like he wasn't wearing a nice pair of slacks, and sitting on concrete that Daichi had never once taken a sweeping brush to. Daichi! Suga raised a hand and waved, as if Daichi would miss him, and the awkwardness melted into something warm. It was like taking the first sip of tea on a really cold day, as cheesy as it sounded. He pushed open his car door and stepped out, and Iwaizumi did the same on the other side. Suga's eyes shifted from Daichi to Iwaizumi, and his mouth made a small O. Iwaizumi, he greeted when they were all standing on Daichi's porch. It's good to see you. Iwaizumi's eyebrows furrowed together a little, and Daichi presumed that he was trying to remember who Suga was. Sugawara? He asked. Just Suga is fine, Suga replied, and then turned back to Daichi. You said you had a possible lead. Daichi nodded. We should probably go in. He pushed past Suga and dug his keys out of his pocket. One by one, the three of them walked over the threshold and slipped off their shoes. Daichi tried not to think about the fact that the last time Suga had been there, he had been helping Daichi move a shitty second-hand couch into the already cramped living room. He tried not to think about the fact that Suga hadn't been here since he moved in, and that the last time he was there, they had eaten their dinner on the floor because Daichi had forgotten to actually buy a table and chairs. The house that belonged to a great uncle Daichi had never met, who passed away a few years prior. Daichi's mom had gotten the house in his will, but because she had a much nicer house already, she rented it out to Daichi, which had probably been the best thing that had happened to him in the 5 years since graduation. Daichi watched Suga sit down on the couch with a sigh. It was really old, but it was also really comfortable. Daichi sat down next to him, and Awaizumi sat down in the red armchair against the other wall. You found a lead? Suga asked him, and leaned up against the arm of the couch. Daichi hummed in confirmation, and quickly explained what he had found to Suga, and how Awaizumi had bought the security footage from the day before Oikawa's disappearance. How many cameras are in the club, Awaizumi? Suga asked. 3 on the dance floor, 1 at the bar and outside, and inside both entrances, he replied, and took a USB out of his pocket. We have from 9:30 in the evening to 2:30 in the morning, so it could take a while. And Awaizumi had been right. Even though they split up the security cameras, Awaizumi got the footage of the dance floor, Daichi got the entrances and exits, and Suga got the bar. They had clocked out after 2 hours. The cameras had terrible lighting, everyone was moving around so much, and it was hard to see faces, so there had been a lot of rewinding again and again. Suga and Daichi both had work the next morning, so when the clock on Daichi's mantelpiece read midnight, they decided to retire until the next day. I'm glad you're doing this, Awaizumi said after Daichi walked him to the door. Do you think we'll find him? Daichi asked and watched Awaizumi put on his shoes. Awaizumi straightened up with a long sigh and searched Daichi's face. No, he said. I don't think we will. Daichi nodded in agreement. Oikawa's case had turned cold for a reason. If the best detectives in Miyagi couldn't solve it, a community safety officer definitely couldn't either. Daichi didn't want to say that walking along the produce aisle with Suga was awkward, but it totally was. Probably mostly on his part, though. Suga looked perfectly content to read down his grocery list and push the shopping cart along, but Daichi was walking about a step behind, opening and closing his mouth because he didn't know what to say. They had met up again the next day, and they searched the grainy security footage from 5 years prior. They rewound it over and over and compared every woman in the club to the one with the shoulder-length bob from the airport. Awaizumi had to go to work 2 hours after they started going through the security cameras, and Suga said he needed to go shopping. Daichi, having nothing better to do and not wanting to spend any more time looking at his computer screen, had tagged along. So they were walking together through the store. It was pretty much silent between the two of them until Suga stopped so abruptly that Daichi bumped into his back with a soft grunt. Sorry. Suga turned around and grinned at him. I didn't realize you were so close behind me. No worries, Daichi said and took a step backwards, rubbing his chest. It's not like you haven't caused me physical harm before. Suga's laugh came out like a cackle, and he picked up a bundle of spring onions from the shelf. What can I say? My love language is violence. You almost winded me during one of our games, Daichi said and pressed his hand harder against his chest as he remembered the sharp jab he'd received during their first official match against Aoba Josai. So, forgive me for not appreciating your love language. Suga grinned and then pouted. Boo, he said, and turned back around before pushing his shopping cart further to the refrigeration section. That's just how I show my affection, Sawamura. Maybe I don't want you to show me affection, Daichi retorted with a soft smile because he knew fully well that he did, in fact, want Suga to show him affection. They hadn't spoken in a week, and even though before that it had been a year, it felt like too long. The warmth that grew in Daichi's chest when Suga just showed up the day before only reminded him of how cold he had felt without him, because he and Suga were never meant to be apart. Lies! Suga said, as if he had been reading Daichi's mind, or maybe it was because he felt the same way. Daichi hoped it was because he felt the same way. Pass me the soft tofu, would you? Daichi moved in front of Suga and reached up to the top shelf of the refrigerator. But just as his fingertips touched the tofu, Daichi was pushed into the shelves by a surprisingly strong kick to the arse. Suga! Daichi turned around and cupped his left arse cheek. I could have knocked something over. Suga laughed into his hand. I'm just showing you how much I missed you, Daichi, he said. Daichi grabbed the tofu and placed it in the shopping cart. Then you should probably have answered my calls. Suga's smile dimmed a little. Yeah, I know, he said. At first I was mad at you and I thought you were calling to apologize. And even though he hadn't explicitly said it, Daichi could tell that he was sorry. He rubbed his hand against the back of his neck and his voice had lost the teasing lilt. But I listened to your first voicemail during lunch at school. One of the kids ran into me and I dropped my phone. I had to get a new one. Suga pulled out his phone from his back pocket and held it up. I have the same number, so I don't have to worry about that, at least. An elderly woman behind them cleared her throat impatiently, so they began walking along the aisle to get out of her way. Sorry, Daichi said to her with a smile, and then he turned back his attention to Suga. Well, I'm glad you weren't ignoring me on purpose. I think I still deserve some compensation. Suga placed a hand on his chest. Compensation? He sounded scandalized. I think I deserve compensation. I had to live without a phone for 5 days. No way! Daichi shook his head. I had to comb through security cameras for a full week. The outfits people choose to wear when they go on vacation are blinding. Suga picked up a block of cheese and threw it into the cart. In a good way? In an astronomically bad way, he replied. Holy fuck, one woman wore this really bright Hawaiian print dress. It was highlighter pink with olive green flowers on it and an orange sun hat. He remembered wincing when he saw it, and had to physically force himself to watch her and her friend walk through both airports. Ew! Suga laughed and scrunched up his nose in disgust. You're right, that does deserve compensation. I'll give you whatever your heart desires, Sawamura Daichi. If Daichi was living in one of those rom-coms that he secretly watched when he couldn't sleep, he would reply with a very suave, I want you, Sugawara Koshi. But he wasn't living in a rom-com, and he wasn't anything like Johnny, and Suga wasn't anything like Baby. And they wouldn't do an overhead lift to the time of my life. So Daichi laughed and said, When I find out what my heart desires, you'll be the first to know. Suga glanced back at him. Perfect. Now let's finish this up and hopefully find that woman on the cameras before Iwaizumi gets back from his shift. Iwaizumi didn't get back for a few hours, and by that point, Daichi and Suga had already made and eaten dinner. Iwaizumi's plate sat in the microwave under a plastic cover. He looked exhausted when Daichi opened the door to let him in, but he had looked exhausted since Daichi saw him the day before, so he wasn't sure if that was a normal thing or if today was just extra difficult. "You okay?" he asked as he stepped aside to let him in. Awaizumi took off his shoes and breathed out a puff of air. "Tired," he mumbled. They walked into the living room, where Suga was staring at his computer screen, rewinding the footage again and again. Awaizumi collapsed onto the couch next to him and closed his eyes. "You can sleep if you want," Daichi said, and sat down in the armchair adjacent to the couch. "We can do this all ourselves." Awaizumi cracked open an eye. "Nah, it's okay," he said, and then yawned. "You got anything to eat?" Daichi stood up from his chair. "Yeah, your dinner's in the microwave. I'll go heat it up." Awaizumi thanked him and watched Suga rewind the footage again. But just as Daichi was a minute into heating up Awaizumi's dinner, he heard his name get yelled from his living room. "What's wrong?" he asked. Daichi expected a fire or an armed robbery or something. What he got was Awaizumi, looking significantly less tired, pointing at Suga's laptop screen. "Come here," Suga said, and he held his finger to the screen where Awaizumi had just been tapping. "Is this her?" Daichi sat down on the other side of Suga and leaned into the screen. She had the same shoulder-length black hair and bangs and the same build. "I'm not sure," he said. "That's a pretty common hairstyle." "That's definitely her." Awaizumi moved Suga's hand away from the screen and gestured to the people the girl was with. "Look, that's Hanamaki, Takahiro, and Matsukawa Issei." Daichi squinted his eyes, and then he recognized them. The wing spiker and middle blocker from the Aoba Josei team. Thank you so much for watching this video. I appreciate all the support you've given me. I am still here. Unfortunately, I had to focus on college for a little while, but I am now on break, and hopefully I can bring you more content. If you have any suggestions, leave them in the comments below. All credits go to the original creator of this fanfiction, or Rorian, on AO3. I would highly appreciate it if you gave this video a like, and you subscribe to the channel, and you hit the notification bell to be notified of when I next upload. There is no pressure to do so, though. Thank you for visiting my cozy corner of the internet. Keep growing, my sunflowers. Mwah!